The car door ripped open before Daniel Cole even hit the brake pedal fully, and a woman in a $2,000 suit dropped into his passenger seat like she owned the vehicle, the company, and maybe his entire life. "Drive," she said, and when he asked who the hell she thought she was, she looked him dead in the eye and answered, "Your CEO, and tonight, you don't get a vote." He had no idea that single sentence would blow apart everything he'd spent 6 quiet years rebuilding. Comment the name of your city below so I can see how far this story has traveled tonight. And if you love stories about second chances, hit subscribe because this one is only getting started. Daniel Cole had exactly one rule left in his life, and it was simple: don't let anyone close enough to hurt you again. He'd built that rule out of wreckage. 6 years ago, his marriage had ended the way a lot of marriages end, quietly and violently at the same time. Not with screaming, but with silence, with a woman packing boxes while he stood in the doorway of what used to be their bedroom, holding a coffee mug he'd forgotten how to set down. 6 years of therapy bills and single dad grocery runs and learning how to braid a little girl's hair from YouTube tutorials at 11 o'clock at night had taught him something he never wanted to learn. Peace was worth more than passion. Quiet was worth more than excitement. A small, boring, predictable life was worth more than any woman who could make his heart do something reckless. So he built himself one. A 3-bedroom house with a leaky gutter he kept meaning to fix. A 10-year-old Ford Explorer with 200,000 miles on it and a rattle in the dash he'd learned to tune out. A steady, unglamorous job in the logistics department of Halstead Dynamics, a tech company so large it had its own zip code, practically where nobody knew his first name, unless they needed a shipment tracked. And most importantly, his daughter Sophie, 8 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, obsessed with dinosaurs, and completely unaware that her father had built an entire fortress around both their hearts. That fortress had one entrance and one exit, and Daniel controlled both. Friday nights were sacred. He'd leave the office at exactly 5:15, stop at the grocery store for ribeye steaks, the good ones, the ones that were technically a little too expensive for a logistics coordinator's salary. But he didn't care, because Friday was the one night a week he let himself feel like life hadn't completely closed its fist around him. He'd pick up Sophie from his sister's place, drive home, grill dinner, while she did cartwheels in the backyard, and then they'd watch an old movie together on the couch until she fell asleep against his shoulder. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. Steak, movie, silence, safety. He had absolutely no idea that plan was about to be shattered by a woman he had spoken to exactly 4 times in his entire career, and every single one of those conversations had lasted under 90 seconds. The parking garage beneath Halstead Dynamics was nearly empty by 5:10. Daniel liked it that way. He liked being one of the last few cars rattling around in the concrete belly of the building, liked the echo of his own footsteps, liked not having to make small talk in the elevator about football or the weather or whatever it was. People talked about when they didn't actually want to talk to each other. He climbed into his Explorer, tossed his jacket into the back seat, and was reaching for the ignition when the passenger door, his passenger door, the one that stuck a little and needed a hard yank to open, swung wide open. He turned, already annoyed, already forming the sentence, "Hey, this isn't a rideshare," in his head, and then he stopped. Because the woman lowering herself into his passenger seat, smoothing down the front of a suit that probably cost more than his mortgage payment, was not some confused stranger who'd wandered into the wrong car. It was Elena Marsh, the CEO. The woman whose face was on the cover of business magazines. The woman who had built Halstead Dynamics from a garage startup into a company worth billions. The woman who, according to office legend, had once ended a board meeting early because a senior executive tried to interrupt her twice and simply said, "You get one interruption a meeting, you've used it," and walked out. That woman was sitting in his passenger seat, pulling the door shut behind her. Reaching for the seatbelt like this was the most normal thing in the world. Daniel's brain short-circuited for a full 3 seconds. "Ms. Marsh." "Elena's fine," she said, clicking the seatbelt into place. "Drive." "I'm sorry, what?" Drive Daniel. Hearing his own first name come out of her mouth hit him like a slap. In 6 years at that company, he was fairly certain she had never once used his first name. He wasn't even sure she'd known it. Is this? He started glancing around the garage like there might be cameras, like this might be some kind of prank, some kind of leadership evaluation exercise the HR department had cooked up to test employee composure under pressure. Is this some kind of company thing? Is somebody filming this? No. Then what is it? She turned her head and looked at him. Really looked at him, the way people rarely look at each other anymore, like she was reading something written on the inside of his skull. This is our first date. Daniel laughed. He couldn't help it. It came out sharp and short, more disbelief than humor. I think there's been a mistake. There's no mistake. You're my CEO. Correct. You just climbed into my car in a parking garage. Also correct. And now you're telling me we're going on a date. Yes. She said it flatly, like she was confirming a shipment number, not upending his entire evening. Tonight, right now, and you don't get a vote. For a long moment, Daniel just stared at her, trying to find the part of this conversation that made sense, and coming up empty every time. This was insane. This was objectively, by every rule of corporate conduct he'd ever been trained on, completely insane. She was his boss's boss's boss. She sat on the top floor with a view of the entire city and a security detail that vetted her elevator rides. And she was sitting in his rattling coffee-stained Explorer, asking him to drive her somewhere like they'd known each other for years. Look, he said carefully, I don't know what's happening right now, but I've got somewhere to be. My daughter. I know about Sophie, Elena said, and something in her voice softened just slightly when she said the name enough that Daniel's spine went rigid. 8 years old, loves dinosaurs. Your sister picks her up on Fridays from her after-school program, and you get her by 5:30. You grill steaks. You watch old movies. Every Friday without fail for the last 2 years. Daniel felt something cold slide down the back of his neck. How do you know that? Because I've been paying attention to you for months, Elena said, and there wasn't a trace of embarrassment in it. No flinch, no apology in her tone, just fact stated the way she probably stated quarterly earnings to a room full of shareholders. I've tried the normal way, Daniel. I really have. I invited you to the department mixer in March. You said you had a family commitment. I asked you to sit with me at the Q2 strategy lunch. You said you'd already eaten. I had my assistant reach out about a coffee meeting to discuss the logistics, restructuring a real meeting, a legitimate excuse, and you rescheduled it 3 times until it quietly disappeared from the calendar. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. He remembered all 3 of those things vaguely, the way you remember declining invitations you never thought twice about. He hadn't been avoiding her specifically. He'd been avoiding entanglement, attention, anything that might crack the careful, boring shell he'd built around his life. I wasn't trying to be rude, he said finally. I know. That's exactly the problem. Elena leaned back against the headrest, staring out the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of them, instead of at him now, and for the first time, Daniel heard something under the confidence, something tired. Everybody in that building wants something from me, Daniel. Every single person. My board wants growth numbers. My investors want quarterly returns. My executives want promotions, want my ear, want to be the one I trust more than the others. Even the men who've asked me to dinner, every single one of them wanted something. A merger, an investment, a photo next to me at a gala that would look good in their portfolio. She finally turned back to look at him. You've never once asked me for anything. You've never even looked at me like you wanted something. You just want to go home and cook steak for your kid. That sounds a lot less impressive when you put it that way, Daniel said, and it came out before he could stop it dry and a little raw. Something flickered across her face, the beginning of a real smile, not the polished camera-ready one he'd seen in press photos. It sounds honest. Do you know how rare that is, honest? Daniel sat with that for a second. The garage was quiet, except for the hum of a distant ventilation fan and the tick of his own dashboard clock ticking closer to 5:15. ticking closer to the moment he was supposed to be walking out the door, toward his sister's house, toward Sophie's gap-toothed grin, toward the one part of his week that felt untouchable. "I have to pick up my daughter," he said, and this time it wasn't an excuse. It was the truth, laid flat on the table between them. "That's not negotiable. Not for you, not for anybody." He expected pushback. He expected the CEO version of "I understand," but some smooth corporate redirection designed to get her way without seeming to demand it. Instead, Elena said, "Good. Good. I wasn't asking you to skip it." She reached for her seatbelt strap and adjusted it entirely unbothered, like she'd already planned 3 steps ahead of him. "Pick up Sophie. I'll wait in the car. Then we'll figure out dinner. All 3 of us, or just the 2 of you, and I'll take a cab home your call. I'm not trying to steal your Friday, Daniel. I'm trying to be part of it for one night and see what happens." Daniel stared at her. There was something profoundly strange about sitting in his own car in the same garage he parked in 5 days a week, being outmaneuvered by the most powerful woman in the building, and yet underneath the strangeness, there was something that didn't feel like an ambush at all. It felt weirdly like being seen. Not as an employee, not as a name on an org chart 3 levels below hers. As a man who cooked steak on Fridays and braided his daughter's hair badly, and had built a life so small and careful that almost nobody bothered to look inside it. Elena Marsh had looked inside it, and instead of being bored, she'd wanted in. "This is a terrible idea," Daniel said mostly to himself. "Probably," Elena agreed. "You're my boss. I'm aware. If anyone at that company finds out you got in my car, they'll gossip for a week, and then something else will happen, and they'll forget," Elena said, waving a hand like she was swatting away a fly. "I've survived worse rumors, Daniel. I built a billion-dollar company as a 31-year-old woman in a room full of men who wanted to see me fail. I think I can survive a rumor about getting into a coordinator's Ford. It's not a rumor I'm worried about." Daniel's voice came out quieter than he meant it to, and he hated how much honesty leaked into it. "It's that I built a life where nothing could touch me. And you just climbed into the one part of it I thought was safe." For a moment, Elena didn't say anything at all. She just looked at him, and there was something in her expression that he wouldn't fully understand until much later recognition maybe. The look of someone who'd built the exact same kind of fortress just with better wallpaper and a corner office. "Nothing that matters is ever completely safe," she said finally. "I learned that the hard way too, Daniel. You can build the walls as high as you want. Eventually, somebody worth letting in is going to knock. The only question is whether you open the door." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then, without fully deciding to, without giving himself permission in any conscious way, he reached down and turned the key. The engine caught. The old Explorer rumbled to life around them. "If Sophie asks who you are," he said, pulling out of the parking spot, hands tighter on the wheel than he wanted them to be, "I'm telling her you're from my work." "That's true," Elena said, buckling herself in more securely, looking for the first time since she'd dropped into his passenger seat almost nervous. "Technically. And if this blows up my career, it won't. You don't know that." "No," she admitted, and there was something almost vulnerable in the honesty of it. Something that didn't match the woman who ran board meetings with an iron grip. "I don't know that for certain. But I know that for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I'd rather take the risk than spend another Friday night alone in a penthouse I paid too much money for eating takeout by myself while my phone buzzes with emails from people who don't actually care whether I'm happy." Daniel drove out of the garage and into the fading gold light of a Friday evening, and something in his chest, something that had been locked down tight for 6 long years, creaked open just slightly, like a door that had rusted on its hinges, finally deciding to move. His sister Diane's house was a 15-minute drive from downtown, a small blue rancher with a wraparound porch and a swing set in the backyard that Diane's own kids had long outgrown but kept anyway for Sophie for the weekends. Daniel had called ahead, a short, strained phone call, from a red light. Elena sitting silently beside him, staring out the window at the city sliding by to warn Diane that he was bringing someone. Someone. Diane's voice had gone up half an octave through the phone speaker. Someone Daniel Cole. Are you telling me you have a date? It's complicated, he'd said, which was, he realized even as he said it, the understatement of the decade. Now pulling into the gravel driveway, he watched Elena's posture change just slightly, just enough that he noticed. The confident set of her shoulders, the effortless command she carried into every room she'd probably ever walked into, softened into something more careful, more human. You okay? He asked, cutting the engine. I don't spend much time around children, Elena admitted, and it was the first thing she'd said all evening that sounded genuinely uncertain. I don't want to say the wrong thing. She's 8. The bar is low. If you know anything about the Cretaceous period, you'll be fine. That earned him a real laugh, short-surprised, like it had escaped before she could catch it. I actually might know something about the Cretaceous period. Then you're already ahead of most of the men I've dated, Daniel said, and immediately regretted it because it implied a pattern, implied he was thinking about this as dating, and he wasn't ready to admit that, not even to himself, not yet. Elena didn't call him on it. She just smiled, small and private, and got out of the car. The front door swung open before they reached it, and Sophie came barreling out in a dinosaur t-shirt, 3 sizes too big, missing teeth on full display arms, already outstretched for her dad. Daniel caught her, swung her up onto his hip, even though she was getting too big for it, and for a moment forgot entirely about the billionaire CEO standing awkwardly on the porch steps behind him. Daddy, Aunt Diane said we're getting pizza because you're bringing a friend. We're having steak, actually, Daniel said. Like always. Sophie's eyes slid past him to Elena, taking her in with the blunt, unfiltered assessment. Only children are capable of the suit, the heels, the careful posture of someone standing somewhere she'd never expected to stand. Are you Daddy's boss? Sophie asked. Elena blinked. Daniel felt his stomach drop. How did you... You're wearing the same watch as the lady on the poster in Daddy's work lobby, Sophie said matter-of-factly, like this was obvious, like the deductive leap required nothing more than eyes and basic reasoning. The one that says, excellence starts here. For a beat, nobody said anything. Then Elena crouched down, actually crouched, knees bent. Suit be damned until she was eye level with an 8-year-old and said, guilty as charged, although I think that poster makes me look taller than I am. Sophie considered this seriously. You are pretty tall. High heels, it's a trick. Do you know about dinosaurs? I know that the Tyrannosaurus Rex actually had terrible eyesight and hunted mostly by smell, which most people don't know, Elena said. And Daniel watched dumbstruck as his daughter's entire face lit up, like she'd just met a celebrity, which in the strange upside-down logic of an 8-year-old's world, she basically had dinosaur knowledge outranking billion-dollar company valuations by a significant margin. Nobody believes me when I say that, Sophie shrieked, delighted already, grabbing Elena's hand and tugging her toward the door. Come see my dinosaur book. I have the one with the real pictures. Elena shot Daniel a look over her shoulder as she was hauled into the house, a look that was somewhere between panic and pure, unguarded joy. And Daniel stood alone in the driveway for a second, watching his daughter drag the most powerful executive in the tech industry toward a bookshelf full of dog-eared paleontology books, and felt something crack open in his chest that he hadn't given himself permission to feel in 6 years. He didn't have a name for it yet. He wasn't ready to, but it felt terrifyingly like hope. Dinner that night didn't go the way Daniel had planned. Nothing about the evening had at this point. Why would dinner be any different? But it went in a direction he hadn't expected to enjoy nearly as much as he did. Diane predictably refused to leave them alone entirely, hovering in the kitchen doorway under the thin pretense of helping, while shooting Daniel wide-eyed looks that clearly meant you brought the CEO to family dinner and did not think to warn me properly. Elena, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by the modest rancher, the mismatched dinnerware, the plastic dinosaur toys scattered across the living room floor. She sat cross-legged on the rug, cross-legged in a $5,000 suit, while Sophie narrated the entire evolutionary history of the velociraptor with the intensity of a woman defending a doctoral thesis. "You're really good with her," Daniel said later. Once Sophie had finally been coaxed toward the bathtub by Diane, leaving the two of them alone on the porch swing, the evening cooling around them, the sky bruising purple at the edges. "I'm not actually," Elena said. "I have no practice. She paused, searching for the words. "I just listened to her." "That's apparently a rare enough thing that it looks like skill." "It is rare," Daniel said quietly. "For adults, I mean. Most people ask kids questions and then talk over the answer. You actually let her finish." Elena looked out of the darkening yard at the swing set at the fireflies just beginning to flicker to life over the grass. "I spend most of my life in rooms where everyone is performing for everyone else. Executives performing confidence, investors performing enthusiasm, me performing certainty, even when I have none." Her voice dropped quieter, more honest than he suspected she meant to be. "Your daughter wasn't performing anything. She was just being a person who's excited about dinosaurs. I don't think I've talked to anyone that honest in years." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. The porch swing creaked gently beneath them, back and forth, back and forth. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Go ahead." "Why me?" He turned to look at her directly, needing to see her face when she answered, needing to know if there was calculation behind it, some angle he wasn't seeing. "You could have anyone. Executives, investors, actors probably if you wanted. Why did you climb into my car?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Daniel wondered if he'd overstepped, if the question had cracked something she wasn't ready to show him. "6 months ago," she said finally. "I was in the elevator coming down from a board meeting that had gone badly. Really badly. The kind where you smile the whole time and then go home and throw up. And you got on at the 4th floor with a box of shipping manifests, and you didn't recognize me at first, and you just said, 'Rough day.' Not because you knew who I was, just because I looked like I was having one." Daniel remembered that, vaguely. An elevator ride, a tired-looking woman he hadn't clocked as the CEO until she'd stepped out on the top floor and the security guard had straightened like a soldier. "I said something like, 'Aren't they all?'" Elena continued, "and you laughed, actually laughed, and said, 'At least you get the good elevator.' And then you got off 2 floors later, and I never saw you look at me like I was your boss. You looked at me like I was just a person having a bad day." She shook her head slightly, almost embarrassed by the admission. "I thought about that elevator ride for weeks, Daniel. I started asking around quietly about who you were. And everything I found out, the divorce, the daughter, the way you turned down a promotion last year because it would have meant more travel and less time with Sophie, none of it matched the kind of ambition everyone else around me has. You'd already decided what mattered. Most people never figure that out. I'm 42 years old, and I'm still figuring it out." Daniel sat with that for a long moment, the porch swing slowing beneath them. "I turned down that promotion because I was scared," he admitted quietly. It was something he hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even Diane. "Not because I'm some enlightened guy who figured out what matters. I was scared that more responsibility meant less time with Sophie, and less time with Sophie is the only thing I'm actually afraid of anymore." "That's not weakness, Daniel." Elena's voice was firm now, certain in a way that cut through the evening air. "That's the bravest thing I've heard all year. Do you know how many men I've met who would trade their kids' bedtime for a corner office without blinking? I've built an entire company out of people like that. You said no. That's not fear. That's knowing exactly what you're not willing to lose." Something about the way she said it, steady, certain like she actually believed it, made Daniel's throat go tight. "I built my whole life around not losing anything else," he said. "After the divorce, I promised myself I'd never let anyone else have that kind of power over me again. Not Sophie's mother. Not anyone." "And now?" Elena asked quietly. Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her. The CEO mask entirely gone, now replaced by a woman sitting on a porch swing in the dark, close enough that he could see the faint tiredness under her eyes, that no amount of expensive skincare could fully hide the loneliness she'd been carrying around a boardroom for years without anyone noticing. "Now I'm sitting on my sister's porch with my boss," he said slowly, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. But I haven't wanted to go home yet, and that scares me more than anything you could put in front of me at that company." Elena's hand found his on the swing between them, not grabbing, not demanding, just resting there, warm and steady. "Good," she said softly. "Scared is honest. I'll take scared and honest over safe and empty any day." They sat like that for a long time, the swing barely moving, the fireflies rising over the yard, Sophie's laughter drifting faintly through the open window as Diane wrestled her into pajamas, and Daniel Cole. A man who had spent 6 years building an unbreakable wall around his heart felt for the first time since his divorce, like maybe walls weren't the only way to survive. Maybe they were just the only way he'd known how. He drove her home a little after 9, the city lights sliding past the windshield in long amber streaks, Sophie asleep in the back seat with a dinosaur book clutched to her chest, having begged to come along for the ride, just to see where the fancy lady lives. Elena's building rose out of the downtown skyline like something out of a magazine, glass and steel, 40 stories of understated wealth. A doorman who straightened visibly the moment her heels hit the sidewalk. "This was not what I planned for tonight," Daniel admitted, idling at the curb. "Was it terrible?" Elena asked, and for a moment, just a moment, he heard real uncertainty in her voice. The CEO, nowhere in sight, just a woman waiting to hear if she'd made a fool of herself. "No," Daniel said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. "It was the best Friday I've had in 6 years, and that terrifies me." Elena smiled, not the practiced photograph-ready smile from the magazine covers, but something smaller and infinitely more real. "Then we're even," she said, "because it terrifies me too." She reached for the door handle, paused, and looked back at him one last time. "For the record," she said, "I know this is complicated. I know what it could cost both of us if people find out. I'm not naive about that, Daniel, but I spent 20 years building a company by refusing to be afraid of hard things. I don't intend to start being afraid now when it actually matters." "And if it goes wrong?" Daniel asked quietly. "If this blows up everything, my job, your reputation, all of it?" Elena considered the question seriously, the way she considered every question, like she was weighing consequences she'd already thought through 100 times before tonight. "Then at least it will have gone wrong because we tried," she said. "Not because we were too scared to find out." She got out of the car, and Daniel watched her walk into the gleaming lobby of the building. The doorman nodding respectfully, the elevator doors sliding shut behind the most powerful woman in the tech industry. A woman who an hour ago had been sitting cross-legged on his sister's living room floor, teaching his daughter about the hunting habits of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. He sat there for a long moment after she disappeared, hands on the wheel. Sophie snoring softly in the back seat, the city humming around him in the dark. 6 years he'd spent building a fortress. 6 years convincing himself that safety was the same thing as happiness. And in one single Friday evening, one open car door, one impossible woman refusing to take no for an answer, every wall he'd built had started quietly and irreversibly to come down. Daniel Cole had no idea sitting there in the dark outside a downtown high-rise that this was only the beginning. He didn't know about Marcus Reed 3 floors below Elena's office, already noticing the way she'd left the building early on a Friday. He didn't know about the photographs that would eventually surface, or the board meeting that would nearly end both of their careers, or the impossible choice he'd be forced to make between the life he'd built to protect himself and the woman who had just shown him what it felt like to want something more. All he knew driving home through the quiet streets with his daughter asleep behind him was that for the first time in 6 long years, he wasn't dreading Monday morning. He was wondering if she'd get in his car again. Monday morning arrived the way Daniel had almost forgotten mornings could feel, with something close to anticipation instead of the flat gray routine he'd trained himself into for 6 years. He sat in his car in the Halstead Dynamics garage a full 10 minutes before he needed to, staring at his own hands on the steering wheel, trying to figure out what version of himself was supposed to walk into that building. The logistics coordinator who'd worked there quietly for 6 years, unnoticed and unbothered. Or the man who'd spent Friday night on his sister's porch swing with the company's CEO, her hand resting on his. both of them admitting out loud that they were terrified and doing it anyway. He didn't get an answer before his phone buzzed. "Good morning. I didn't sleep much. Thinking about dinosaur facts I got wrong. Please don't tell Sophie I said the Stegosaurus had 2 brains. I looked it up. It's a myth. I feel like a fraud." Daniel read it twice, and something in his chest loosened just slightly, a laugh escaping before he could stop it. Too late. She's already texted her whole class. She doesn't have a phone. She's 8. I know. I just wanted to see if you'd panic. There was a pause, 3 dots appearing and disappearing twice before her reply came through. "I don't panic. I strategize." "Sure you do. I'm serious. Give me 20 minutes and I'll have a full correction memo ready for her, complete with sources." Daniel sat there grinning at his phone like a teenager, which was such a foreign feeling that he actually checked his own reflection in the rearview mirror to make sure he still looked like a 38-year-old man and not some lovesick kid. He looked the same. Tired eyes, a little gray creeping into his beard, the same face he'd worn into that garage every day for 6 years. But something behind the eyes was different. He could see it. He put his phone away, grabbed his badge, and walked into the building like he had 1,000 times before. Except this time, he found himself standing a little straighter in the elevator, and when the doors opened on the 4th floor, he caught himself glancing upward toward the top floor, toward an office he'd never once had a reason to think about before Friday night. The first few weeks were careful. Daniel insisted on that, and to his surprise, Elena agreed without pushing back. "We do this quietly." He told her the second time she showed up at his house, not at his sister's this time, but at his actual house, the one with the leaky gutter and the grill in the backyard, arriving after Sophie was asleep, wearing jeans instead of a suit. For the first time since he'd known her, looking almost unrecognizable without the armor of Halstead Dynamics wrapped around her shoulders. Nobody at work knows. Nobody finds out. Not because I'm ashamed of this, because I'm not even a little, but because I've seen what happens to people's careers when rumors start flying and I've got a kid depending on my paycheck. "Agreed," Elena said, sitting at his kitchen table like it was the most natural thing in the world, watching him season a piece of chicken like she'd never seen a man cook in his own kitchen before, which, given the parade of caterers and executive chefs that probably orbited her actual life, might have genuinely been true. "Discretion. I can do discretion." "Can you, though?" Daniel raised an eyebrow at her. "You climbed into my car in a parking garage in broad daylight. That," Elena said primly, "was a calculated risk. I timed it for when the garage was mostly empty." "You timed it." "I had my assistant check the security footage schedule for the last 2 months. You always leave between 5:05 and 5:20. The garage cameras have a rotation gap around 5:10. I picked my moment." Daniel set down the tongs and stared at her. "That is either the most romantic or the most terrifying thing anyone has ever told me." "Why not both?" Elena said, and there was something genuinely pleased in her voice, like she'd been waiting for the chance to admit it, like she'd been sitting on that particular piece of planning for weeks, proud of it, the way some people were proud of closing a big deal. "You do understand this is insane." "I run a $12 billion company, Daniel. Insane is my baseline. This is the sanest thing I've done in years." He laughed a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere low in his chest, the kind he hadn't let himself do freely and longer than he wanted to admit. And something about the sound of it seemed to catch Elena off guard, because she went quiet for a second, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I just like that sound. You should make it more." They fell into a rhythm after that, a careful, secret rhythm built around Daniel's 5 o'clock departures and Sophie's bedtime, and Elena's ability to disappear from her own building without a trail of assistants noticing where she'd gone. She learned his neighborhood the way to avoid the one street with the broken traffic light, the exact grocery store where he bought the good steaks. He learned slowly, painstakingly, the woman underneath the CEO, the parts of Elena Marsh that never made it into the magazine profiles. She told him one night on his back porch about her father, a machinist who'd worked the same factory floor for 31 years and never once made it past shift supervisor. Not because he lacked the talent, but because nobody ever gave him the chance to prove it. She told him how she'd promised herself at 14 years old, watching her father come home exhausted and overlooked, for the 1,000th time, that she would never let anyone tell her what she was capable of. She told him about the early years of Halstead Dynamics. 3 people in a rented office above a dry cleaner surviving on ramen and stubbornness, investors laughing her out of rooms because she was 26 and a woman, and had the audacity to think she understood technology better than men twice her age. "I built an empire," she told him, staring out at the dark yard voice, quiet in a way Daniel had never heard from her before, not even in their most private moments. "And somewhere along the way, I forgot to build a life to put inside it." "You have a life," Daniel said gently. "I have a schedule," Elena corrected. "There's a difference. A life has people in it who aren't asking you for something. Before you." "Daniel, I genuinely could not remember the last time someone spent an evening with me, and didn't want a signature, an investment, or a photo op by the end of it." Daniel reached over and took her hand in easy motion. Now something that had stopped feeling strange somewhere around the 3rd week, and held it without saying anything for a long moment, just letting the silence sit between them comfortable, instead of empty. "I'm not going to ask you for anything," he said finally. "I know," Elena said. "That's the whole problem. I don't know what to do with a person who doesn't want anything from me." "You could just let them love you," Daniel said. And the word came out before he'd fully decided to say it, hanging in the air between them, like something fragile and irreversible. Elena turned to look at him, and for the first time since the night she'd climbed into his passenger seat, Daniel saw something in her face that looked almost like fear. Not fear of him, but fear of the word itself. Fear of what it might mean to actually let someone in after 20 years of building walls disguised as boardrooms. "That's a very dangerous thing to say to a woman like me," she said softly. "Why?" "Because I might actually let you." Sophie adored her. That was the part Daniel hadn't fully braced himself for. Not the complicated logistics of dating his CEO in secret, not the risk to his career, but the speed and totality with which his 8-year-old daughter fell in love with Elena Marsh. It started with dinosaurs and expanded rapidly into an entire shared universe. Elena began showing up with small gifts that had nothing to do with impressing Daniel and everything to do with genuinely delighting Sophie. A fossil replica from a museum gift shop, a subscription to a kids' science magazine, a promise made with total seriousness that one day she would take Sophie to see the actual dinosaur skeletons at the Smithsonian. Because photos in a book are fine, but you should see the real bones at least once in your life. You don't have to do all that, Daniel told her one evening, watching Sophie fall asleep on the couch with the fossil replica clutched in one hand, a rerun of some nature documentary murmuring on the TV. "I want to," Elena said simply. "Is that allowed?" "Of course it's allowed. He hesitated, trying to find the right words, aware of how much was riding on getting them right. "I need you to understand something. Sophie's mother left when Sophie was 2. She doesn't remember her. I'm the only consistent adult she's ever had. If you're really in this with both of us, not just me, I need to know you understand what that means. Because if you disappear the way her mother did, it won't just break my heart. It'll break something in her that I'm not sure ever heals right." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel watched her, carefully, watched the woman who ran board meetings and crushed hostile takeovers, and never once, according to office legend, backed down from a fight, actually consider the weight of what he was asking. "I've never had anyone depend on me the way she's starting to depend on me," Elena said finally. "That terrifies me more than any negotiation I've ever walked into. But Daniel, I don't do things halfway. I never have. If I'm choosing this, I'm choosing all of it. You, her, the mess, the risk, the complications. I'm not the kind of person who leaves things unfinished." "People say that," Daniel said quietly. "And then things get hard, and they leave anyway." "Then watch me prove I'm not people," Elena said, and there was something fierce in it, something that reminded Daniel briefly and vividly of the woman who'd once ended a board meeting by walking out mid-sentence, refusing to be interrupted twice, by men who'd underestimated her for years. "I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. Ask anyone who's ever worked for me." Daniel wanted to believe her. Some deep, guarded part of him, the part still bruised from a marriage that had ended in silent boxes and a coffee mug he couldn't set down, wanted to believe her so badly it frightened him more than her walking into his car ever had. So he let himself believe her. Not because it was safe, because for the first time in 6 years, he decided safety wasn't the only thing worth choosing anymore. It couldn't stay hidden forever. Daniel knew that somewhere in the rational part of his brain that still functioned, even as the rest of him fell headfirst into something he hadn't let himself feel since before the divorce. Companies the size of Halstead Dynamics didn't keep secrets. Not really. Not with security cameras in every garage, badge readers logging every entrance and exit, executive assistants who noticed patterns the way sharks noticed blood in water. The man who noticed first was Marcus Reed. Marcus worked 2 floors above Daniel in strategic operations. A sharp-jawed executive in his mid-40s who had spent the better part of a decade positioning himself as Elena's natural successor, cultivating relationships with board members, making sure his name came up in every conversation about the company's future leadership. He was smart, ambitious, and utterly convinced that the only thing standing between him and the corner office was time and proximity to Elena Marsh. Proximity he had been carefully engineering for years through late meetings, strategic lunches, and a persistent, professionally deniable campaign to be seen as her closest advisor. He noticed the pattern in the garage camera logs almost by accident, reviewing footage for an unrelated security audit and catching 3 separate times over 2 months. Elena Marsh's silhouette crossing into a frame it had no business being in the lower garage level. 3-employee parking nowhere near the executive elevator she was supposed to use. Marcus watched the footage 4 times before he understood what he was looking at. He didn't say anything at first. He was too smart for that, too patient, the kind of man who understood that information was only valuable if you knew exactly when and how to use it. Instead, he watched. He cross-referenced badge logs. He learned Daniel Cole's name, his department, his 6 years of unremarkable competent service in logistics. A nobody as far as Marcus was concerned. A man with absolutely no business anywhere near the CEO of a $12 billion company. He followed them once on a Friday evening from a careful distance and watched Elena climb into a battered Ford Explorer in a suburban driveway, watched her laugh. Actually laugh freely, in a way he had genuinely never once seen her laugh in a decade of working alongside her at something the man behind the wheel had said. Marcus sat in his car across the street for 20 minutes after they went inside, and by the time he drove away, he had already begun constructing piece by piece exactly how he intended to use what he'd found. Daniel felt it before he understood it, the shift in the air around the office, subtle at first, the kind of thing he might have written off as paranoia if it hadn't kept happening. A coworker who usually nodded a casual hello now looked away too quickly. His supervisor, a mild-mannered man named Gerald, who'd never once had a reason to scrutinize Daniel's work, suddenly started asking pointed questions about his recent expense reports, his parking garage entry times, the unusual pattern in his after-hours building access. "Is there a problem?" Daniel asked, standing in Gerald's small office trying to keep his voice level, even as something cold started crawling up his spine. No problem," Gerald said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Just routine. HR's doing some kind of audit. Nothing to worry about." Daniel knew with the specific sick certainty of a man watching a wave build before it breaks that it was not nothing to worry about. He texted Elena that night, hands unsteady in a way he hated. "Someone's asking questions about my badge access. HR audit. Started this week. I don't think it's a coincidence." Her response came back almost instantly. "I'll look into it. Don't panic. I'll come by tonight." She arrived an hour later, still in her work clothes, having clearly left the building in a hurry, tension written across her shoulders in a way Daniel had never seen before. Not even in the early days, when she'd still been carefully assembling the courage to climb into his car in the first place. "Marcus Reed," she said the moment Daniel closed the front door behind her, before he'd even had a chance to offer her coffee, before Sophie's bedroom door had fully finished creaking shut for the night. I had my assistant quietly check who requested the security footage pull that flagged your access logs. It was him. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Who is that? Executive VP Strategic Operations. He's been circling my job for 3 years, positioning himself with the board, waiting for any opening he can use to make himself look indispensable, and me look... She paused, searching for the word, and Daniel watched something harden in her jaw, vulnerable. And he knows about us. I think so. I don't know how much or what he's planning to do with it. But Daniel, if he's pulled garage footage, if he's cross-referenced your badge logs, he's not doing this out of idle curiosity. He's building a case. A case for what? Elena sat down heavily at the kitchen table, and for the first time since Daniel had known her, she looked genuinely rattled, not the careful performative vulnerability she sometimes let slip in quiet moments on the porch swing, but real unguarded fear. For my removal, she said quietly, or at least the beginning of it. If Marcus can convince the board that I've compromised my judgment, that I'm giving preferential treatment to an employee I'm personally involved with, that I've created a conflict of interest, that my leadership can't be trusted to separate the personal from the professional, he doesn't need proof of any actual wrongdoing. He just needs enough doubt. Boards don't need certainty to force a resignation, Daniel. They just need enough noise that keeping you becomes more expensive than letting you go. And what happens to me? Daniel asked, and he heard the edge in his own voice, the old fear rising up fast and sharp, the fear he'd built his entire quiet life around, avoiding the fear of losing everything because he'd let himself want something. I don't know, Elena admitted. I genuinely don't know. And I hate that I don't know because I promised you I wouldn't let this hurt you, and I meant it, and now... Elena. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, steadying his voice, even as his own pulse hammered in his ears. Look at me. We knew this was a risk. We talked about this the very first night. Knowing it and living it are different things, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, the first real crack Daniel had ever heard in her. I've spent 20 years building a reputation as someone who never lets her guard down, who never gives anyone ammunition. And the first time I actually let myself want something for me, instead of the company, I handed a man like Marcus Reed exactly the weapon he's been waiting years to find. So we don't panic, Daniel said, forcing his voice into something steadier than he felt. We don't hand him a reaction to work with. If he's building a case, he needs something to actually happen. As long as we haven't done anything wrong, and we haven't, Elena, nothing about this has ever been about advantage or favoritism, there's no actual case to build. You don't know Marcus, Elena said grimly. He doesn't need facts. He needs a narrative. And a narrative doesn't require truth. It just requires a story people are willing to believe. The story arrived 3 days later, and it arrived with photographs. Daniel was in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon shipment review when Gerald appeared at his desk, face pale, and asked him in a voice tight with something between apology and dread to come with him to a conference room on the 7th floor, a floor Daniel had never once had reason to visit in 6 years of employment. The room was full when he walked in. 2 people from HR he didn't recognize. A company attorney introduced with a title Daniel immediately forgot in his rising panic. And Marcus Reed, sitting at the head of the table, with the calm, satisfied posture of a man who had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. Mr. Cole, Marcus said, sliding a manila folder across the table with 2 fingers unhurried, almost theatrical in his composure. Thank you for coming. We have some concerns we need to discuss. Daniel opened the folder with hands that felt disconnected from the rest of his body. Photographs, a dozen of them printed on plain office paper, grainy but unmistakable, Elena climbing into his Explorer in the parking garage. Elena on his back porch, close enough to him that there was no mistaking what the photo suggested. Elena walking into his house at night, the timestamp in the corner reading 9:47 p.m. I don't understand what this has to do with my job performance, Daniel said, forcing his voice to stay level even as his pulse roared in his ears. It has everything to do with your job performance, Marcus said smoothly, because it raises serious questions about whether your continued employment and any future advancement within this company has been influenced by a personal relationship with the CEO. That's not a small concern, Mr. Cole. That's a governance issue, a conflict of interest issue. Frankly, it's the kind of issue that could expose this entire company to significant legal liability if it isn't handled correctly. There's no conflict of interest, Daniel said. I've never received a single benefit from this relationship. Not a promotion, not a raise, nothing. Check my file. I turned down a promotion last year before any of this even started. That's what you say, Marcus replied, unbothered, folding his hands on the table with the calm precision of a man who had rehearsed this exact conversation in his head dozens of times. But perception matters just as much as reality in situations like this, Mr. Cole. And the perception, once this becomes public, which it will one way or another, is going to be devastating. For the company, for Ms. Marsh's reputation with the board, and frankly, for you. Do you understand what happens to a man's career when he's publicly known as the employee who slept his way into the CEO's personal life? Do you understand what that does to how every colleague in this building looks at you from that day forward? Daniel felt something hot and dangerous rising in his chest, not fear anymore, but anger, sharp and clarifying. Is this a threat? This is an opportunity, Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. I'm prepared to make this entire situation disappear, Mr. Cole. No board inquiry, no public scandal, no damage to your career or Sophie's stability or anything else you care about. All I'm asking is that you make a sensible decision. Resign quietly. Cite personal reasons. Take a generous severance package, very generous, more than fair, for a coordinator position, and walk away before this becomes something neither of us can control. And if I don't, Marcus's smile didn't waver, then these photographs find their way to the board this week instead of me quietly handling it internally. And Ms. Marsh spends the next several months fighting for her job instead of running her company, while you spend those same months explaining to prospective employers why your last position ended in scandal. I'd think very carefully, Mr. Cole, about which version of this story you'd prefer to live in. Daniel sat very still, the folder of photographs open in front of him. His own life laid bare on cheap printer paper in a conference room full of strangers who had already decided before he'd said a single word exactly what kind of man they thought he was. He thought about Sophie, about the promotion he'd turned down to protect their evenings together, about the 6 years of quiet, careful safety he'd built specifically to avoid ever ending up in a room like this one at the mercy of someone else's power. And then he thought about Elena sitting cross-legged on his living room floor, teaching his daughter about the hunting habits of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, about the porch swing and her hand in his, and the way she'd said, "At least it will have gone wrong because we tried." "I need to think about it," Daniel said finally, his voice steadier than he expected. "Of course," Marcus said, sliding a business card across the table, unbothered, patient, as a man who already believed he'd won. "Take the rest of the day. But Mr. Cole, I wouldn't take too long. Opportunities like this one don't stay open indefinitely." Daniel walked out of that conference room with the folder of photographs clutched in one white-knuckled hand, and by the time he reached the elevator, his phone was already buzzing a text from Elena, sent 12 minutes earlier, before any of this had even happened, before Marcus Reed had sprung his trap. "Dinner tonight. Sophie wants to teach me the difference between a Triceratops and a Styracosaurus. I told her I already know. She said I'm wrong. I need backup." Daniel stood in the empty elevator, staring at the message, at the easy, ordinary happiness of it, and felt his hands begin to shake for the first time all afternoon. He didn't answer right away. He needed to figure out first exactly how much he was willing to lose to keep it. He didn't tell Elena about the meeting until that night, after Sophie had finally gone to bed, after an hour of forcing himself through an ordinary dinner and ordinary conversation, with a folder of photographs sitting like a live grenade in his car outside. When he finally laid it all out for her, Marcus, the photographs, the ultimatum, the severance package dangled like a bribe. Elena went very quiet, her face draining of color in a way that frightened him more than anything Marcus had said in that conference room. "He's blackmailing you," she said finally, her voice flat with a fury Daniel had never heard from her before. "He's giving me a choice," Daniel corrected, though even saying it out loud the words felt hollow wrong. "There's no choice in that room, Daniel. There's coercion dressed up in a severance package." Elena stood up so fast, her chair scraped hard against the kitchen floor, pacing now, arms crossed tight over her chest, 20 years of boardroom composure cracking open in real time in front of him. "He's using photographs of you and me to force you out of a job you're good at, that you've earned because he's decided our relationship is a liability he can leverage into taking my company." "Is he wrong?" Daniel asked quietly. "About the liability part, I mean. Elena, if this gets out, if the board sees those photos before we've had a chance to control the story, what happens to you?" "I don't care what happens to me," Elena said, and it came out fast, unguarded, more honest than anything else she'd said all night. "I care what happens to you. To Sophie. I dragged you into this, Daniel. I climbed into your car and told you not to give me a vote. And now a man is threatening to blow up your entire life because I wasn't careful enough, wasn't smart enough to see this coming. Stop!" Daniel crossed the kitchen and took her by the shoulders, steady grounding the way he might have once steadied Sophie through a nightmare. "You didn't do this to me. Marcus Reed did this. And I'm not going to let him win by tearing us apart out of fear before he's even forced our hand." "So what do we do?" Elena asked. And for the first time since the night in the parking garage, Daniel heard real desperation in her voice, the sound of a woman who had built an empire out of always having the answer, and was for the first time in years completely out of them. Daniel didn't have a plan yet. Not really. Just a growing stubborn certainty settling into his chest, cold and clear as the night Elena had first told him that nothing worth having stays completely safe. "We don't resign," he said finally. "We don't hide. We don't let him decide how this story ends. Daniel, if this goes to the board, then it goes to the board," Daniel said, and he meant it more fully than he'd meant almost anything in 6 careful, guarded years. "Because I would rather lose that job fighting for something real than keep it by letting a man like Marcus Reed convince me I don't deserve to be happy." Elena stared at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Fear still, but something else now too. Something that looked almost like the beginning of hope fighting its way up through the panic. "He's going to come after both of us," she said quietly. "Hard. And I don't know yet if we can win." "I know," Daniel said, "but I'd rather go down swinging beside you than walk away safe and alone. I already tried safe and alone, Elena. I built 6 years of it. It wasn't a life. It was just waiting to feel something again." Outside the city hummed on, indifferent to the storm quietly gathering above both their heads. A board meeting, not yet scheduled, a folder of photographs, not yet delivered. A reputation 20 years in the making. Balanced now on the edge of a decision neither of them had fully made yet. But standing in his kitchen, Elena's hands finally steady in his, Daniel understood with a clarity that surprised him that whatever came next, the investigation, the board, the risk to everything, he'd carefully rebuilt after his divorce, he was no longer the man who'd have run from it. He was the man who'd decided somewhere between a parking garage and a porch swing and a little girl's dinosaur book that some things were worth the fight. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, 9 days after Marcus Reed slid that folder of photographs across a conference room table, and every one of those 9 days felt to Daniel like walking a tightrope strung between 2 versions of his life, neither of which he was ready to fully live in yet. He went to work each morning like nothing had changed. Badge scanning at the same door. Coffee from the same machine shipment, manifests stacked on his desk in the same careful piles. But underneath the routine, something had shifted permanently. People looked at him differently now, not with open hostility, nothing so simple as that, but with the particular uncomfortable curiosity of coworkers who had heard just enough of a rumor to be interested, and not enough to know what to do with it. Gerald avoided eye contact entirely. A woman from accounting he'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with in 6 years suddenly wanted to have lunch. Daniel understood exactly what was happening. The story was leaking slowly, the way stories always did in buildings full of people with nothing better to gossip about than each other's private lives. He hadn't given Marcus an answer. That was the one thing he'd held on to through 9 sleepless nights. The refusal to resign. The refusal to let a folder of grainy photographs decide the shape of the rest of his life. But refusing to resign meant the alternative was now barreling toward both of them at full speed. A formal board inquiry called at Marcus's urging into what he was carefully publicly calling potential governance concerns regarding CEO conduct. Elena had explained it to him the night the summons arrived, sitting at his kitchen table, with a printed copy of the board notice in front of her. Her voice flat, with the particular calm of someone holding herself together, through sheer force of will. "They're not accusing me of anything illegal," she said. "Marcus is smarter than that. He knows there's no fraud here, no embezzlement, nothing that would actually violate my contract. What he's doing is worse in a way. He's questioning my judgment, my fitness to lead. He's telling the board that a CEO who lets personal feelings compromise professional boundaries can't be trusted with a $12 billion company. And he's using you, Daniel, using photographs of you and Sophie and me on a porch swing as evidence. Can they actually fire you over this?" Daniel asked, and he hated how much his voice shook asking it. "They can do worse than fire me," Elena said quietly. "They can force a resignation dressed up as a mutual decision. They can strip my authority piece by piece until the title means nothing. Marcus doesn't need to win outright, Daniel. He just needs to make the board believe I'm a liability. Boards protect shareholder value above almost everything else. If enough of them believe my judgment is compromised, they won't need a smoking gun. They'll just need doubt." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had every night that week, a small, steady gesture that had become its own kind of promise between them. "Then we give them something better than doubt," he said. "We give them the truth." "The truth is exactly what Marcus is twisting," Elena said. "No," Daniel said. "The truth is that in 6 years I never once asked you for anything, and you never once gave me anything I hadn't earned on my own merit. The truth is that this us has never touched a single business decision either of us has made. That's not spin, Elena. That's just what actually happened. We just have to prove it." Elena studied him for a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind her eyes. "You're the calmest person I've ever met in the middle of a crisis. Do you know that I raised a kid through a divorce?" Daniel said simply. "Calm is the only thing that's ever actually worked." The days leading up to the board meeting became a strange, quiet kind of war, fought not in dramatic confrontations, but in careful preparation. Document requests, HR interviews, conducted in small windowless rooms. Daniel answering the same questions over and over, from people who had already half decided what they wanted to believe about him. "Did Ms. Marsh ever offer you preferential treatment? Have you ever discussed confidential business matters together? Did your relationship begin before or after any performance reviews were conducted?" Daniel answered every question honestly, plainly, without embellishment, and every honest answer seemed to frustrate the HR investigator slightly, as though she'd been hoping even for something messier, some contradiction she could seize on. There wasn't one. 6 years of unremarkable performance reviews. A promotion turned down on record months before he'd ever set foot in Elena's world. No raises outside the standard company-wide adjustments. No favors, no special assignments, no unexplained bonuses. "You understand," the investigator said on the 3rd day, closing her folder with something like reluctant respect, "that this doesn't automatically resolve the board's concerns. Perception matters as much as fact in situations like these. I understand that a man built a case against me out of parking garage footage and a telephoto lens," Daniel said, keeping his voice level with an effort that cost him more than he let show. "I understand that nothing in 6 years of my employment file supports any accusation of impropriety. And I understand that if this board decides to punish Ms. Marsh for the crime of falling in love with someone who happens to work in her logistics department, that says a great deal more about this company's priorities than it does about either of us." The investigator didn't respond to that. She just nodded, gathered her folder and left, and Daniel sat alone in the small windowless room for a long moment, afterward hands shaking slightly with the adrenaline of having said out loud, in an official capacity, the words "fallen in love" for the very first time. He hadn't said them to Elena yet. Not directly, not with the full weight of what they meant. He decided sitting there that he wasn't going to wait for a board decision to say them. He found her that evening on the top floor in the office he'd never once had reason to visit in 6 years, past the assistant who buzzed him through with visible surprise, past the floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the entire city into a carpet of gold light below. Elena was standing at the window with her back to the door, arms crossed still in her suit. Though the hour was late, the posture of a woman holding herself upright through sheer willpower. "You shouldn't be here," she said without turning around, though there was no real reproach in it. "If anyone sees you in this office right now—" "I don't care," Daniel said, and something in his voice made her finally turn to face him. She looked exhausted in a way he hadn't seen before, not the polished, camera-ready exhaustion of a CEO working late, but something rawer, something that had been building for 9 days and had finally started to show through the cracks in her composure. "The board's already been talking," she said quietly. "I don't have all the votes. Marcus has been working the phones for weeks longer than I realized. Some of them are scared, Daniel. Scared of the headlines, scared of shareholder reaction, scared of anything that looks even a little bit like scandal. I might actually lose this." "Then let's talk about what happens if you do," Daniel said, closing the distance between them, taking both her hands in his steady, despite the fear sitting cold in his own stomach. "Because I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it. Not just process it the way you process everything else, like a problem to be managed." "Daniel, I don't care if you lose the company," he said, and watched her flinch slightly at the words. Watched her open her mouth to argue, before he pressed on. "I don't mean that the way it sounds. I know what you built. I know what it cost you. I know it's not nothing. But Elena, I have spent 9 days watching you treat this like it's the only thing that matters. Like losing this job would be the end of who you are, and I need you to hear me say it wouldn't be. You would still be the woman who crouched down in a suit to talk to an 8-year-old about dinosaurs because you actually wanted to know what she thought. You'd still be the woman who remembered every single detail about my Friday routine before you ever said a word to me about it, because you were paying attention in a way almost nobody pays attention to another person anymore. None of that goes away if the board votes you out on Thursday. None of that was ever the CEO. That was always just you." Elena's composure held together through 9 days of investigators and closed-door meetings, and Marcus Reed's smiling, patient threats finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a single tear sliding down her face that she wiped away almost angrily, like she resented her own body for betraying her after 20 years of perfect control. "I've never let anyone see me like this," she admitted, voice cracking. "Not once. Not in 20 years of building this company." "I know," Daniel said gently. "I think that's exactly why I love you." The words hung in the air between them, finally spoken, finally real, and Elena's breath caught audibly, her hands tightening around his. "Say it again," she whispered. "I love you," Daniel said. No hesitation this time, no fear in it at all, only certainty. "I love you, and I don't care what that folder of photographs says about us, and I don't care what Marcus Reed tells that board on Thursday. Whatever happens, I'm not walking away from this, from you. I already tried walking away from everything that scared me once, and it cost me 6 years of a life that was safe and completely empty. I'm not doing that again." Elena closed the distance between them and kissed him slow and certain, and entirely unlike the careful, guarded woman who had climbed into his car weeks earlier with a plan and a timeline and a calculated risk assessment. This was something else entirely. This was a woman finally letting herself fall. "I love you too," she said when they finally broke apart. "I think I loved you the day you got on that elevator and asked if I was having a rough day without knowing who I was. I just didn't have the courage to say it until you climbed onto my floor and said it first." They stood there together at the window, the city spread out gold and glittering beneath them, and for a moment, just a moment, the board meeting Marcus Reed, The folder of photographs, all of it receded into something distant and manageable, something they might actually survive together. Neither of them yet knew how badly Marcus intended to escalate before Thursday arrived. The email went out Wednesday night, less than 12 hours before the board was scheduled to convene, not from Marcus directly, careful as always to keep his own fingerprints hidden, but from an anonymous internal account that HR would later trace back too late to matter to a burner address created and abandoned within the hour. It went to every senior executive in the company. It went to 3 business journalists who covered the tech sector. It went with a kind of deliberate cruelty that made Daniel's stomach turn when he finally saw it to Diane. Daniel's sister found through nothing more than a cursory public records search, apparently included simply to maximize the damage to make sure the fallout reached as deep into Daniel's life as possible. The email contained 4 of the photographs. It contained a carefully worded narrative framing Elena Marsh as a CEO who had compromised professional judgment for a personal relationship with a subordinate employee, questioning whether preferential access and confidential company information might have been involved, and closing with a line that made Daniel's hands shake with fury when he finally read it. The board and shareholders deserve leadership free of hidden conflicts of interest. It is time for accountability. By 7 the next morning, Daniel's phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Diane calling 3 times in a row, voice tight with confusion and worry when he finally picked up. A reporter somehow obtaining his personal cell number, leaving a voicemail requesting comment on his relationship with Halstead Dynamics CEO Elena Marsh. Gerald texting a single line, "Are you okay? This is insane, call me that." Daniel didn't have the emotional bandwidth to answer. He drove Sophie to Diane's that morning in near total silence, his mind racing through every possible outcome of the day ahead, terrified in a way he hadn't let himself be terrified since the divorce. Not for himself, but for the 8-year-old in the back seat, who had no idea her entire family's private life had just become fodder for a corporate power struggle she'd never understand. "Daddy, are you sad?" Sophie asked, watching him in the rearview mirror with the unsettling perceptiveness only children seemed to possess. "A little bit, baby," Daniel admitted, because he'd promised himself years ago in the wreckage of his divorce that he would never lie to her about his feelings, even when the truth was hard. "Grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." "Is it about Elena?" Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you smile different when you talk to her," Sophie said matter-of-factly, "and you're not smiling right now." Daniel didn't have an answer for that. He just reached back and squeezed her small hand where it rested on the console and drove the rest of the way to Diane's. In silence, his chest tight with a fear that had nothing to do with boards or shareholders, and everything to do with the possibility that this fight might cost his daughter something he could never fully give back to her. The board meeting convened at 9 sharp in a conference room on the 40th floor that Daniel had never seen, that he technically had no right to be in at all, except Elena had insisted over the objections of at least 2 board members that he be present. "If they're going to discuss my personal life as a matter of corporate governance," she'd told him the night before, jaw set with the particular stubbornness Daniel had come to recognize as immovable, "then the person they're discussing gets to be in the room. I won't have this conversation happen about you without you." Marcus Reed sat near the head of the table when Daniel walked in, flanked by 2 board members Daniel didn't recognize, wearing the calm, satisfied expression of a man who believed the outcome of the day was already decided. He didn't even glance up as Daniel took a seat near the back of the room, at Elena's insistence close enough to hear everything far enough to stay technically outside the formal proceedings. Elena stood at the head of the long table, back straight, hands folded in front of her, and Daniel watched the transformation happen in real time, the exhausted, frightened woman from the window the night before, folding herself back into the armor of the CEO. Everyone in that room had spent years learning to fear and respect. "I understand," she began, voice level, carrying easily across the room, without needing to be raised, "that this board has convened today to discuss allegations regarding my judgment, my conduct, and my fitness to continue leading this company. I want to address those allegations directly, without spin, without deflection, because I believe every person in this room deserves the truth rather than the carefully edited narrative that's been circulating through anonymous emails since last night. She let that land, her eyes moving deliberately to Marcus, who held her gaze without flinching, still confident, still certain. Yes, Elena continued. I am in a relationship with Daniel Cole, an employee in our logistics department. I am not going to apologize for that because there is nothing to apologize for. I have not given him preferential treatment. I have not shared confidential information. I have not made a single business decision influenced by our relationship. Every claim to the contrary in that email is a lie constructed by someone who has spent 3 years positioning himself for my job and finally found what he believed was leverage to take it. A ripple moved through the room, several board members exchanging glances. Marcus's jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. That's a serious accusation, Elena, said an older board member near the center of the table. A silver-haired man Daniel would later learn was the longest-serving member of the board, a founding investor who had backed Halstead Dynamics before it was worth anything at all. Do you have proof to support it? I do, Elena said, and nodded toward the door. It was a moment Daniel hadn't been told about, in advance. Elena's own careful, quiet countermove, assembled over the same 9 days Marcus had spent building his case. 2 women walked into the conference room, one from HR carrying a slim folder, and one Daniel didn't recognize at all, introduced as an independent forensic auditor. Elena had hired privately outside the company's normal channels, specifically to trace the origin of the anonymous email and the security footage request that had started the entire chain of events. The footage that photographed Mr. Cole and myself was pulled using Marcus Reed's security credentials on March 14th. The auditor said, opening her folder, voice clinical and unhurried. The anonymous email sent last night originated from an account created and deleted within a 90-minute window Wednesday evening, traced through IP metadata to a private residence registered to Marcus Reed's brother-in-law. And this, she slid a printed document across the table toward the board, is a record of 3 separate meetings Mr. Reed held with board members over the past 6 weeks, in which, according to 2 of the participants who agreed to be interviewed on record, he discussed strategies for accelerating a leadership transition well before any of these photographs existed. The room went very still. Marcus's composure finally cracked just slightly, a muscle working in his jaw. This is absurd. You're suggesting I fabricated. I'm suggesting, the auditor said calmly, that the timeline doesn't support your narrative of discovering a governance concern and responsibly escalating it. It supports a narrative of deliberately manufacturing a scandal to force out a CEO you've spent years trying to replace. That's a serious allegation to level in this room, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly for the first time, the crack in his own composure widening. It is, Elena said, stepping forward, her voice cutting through the room with the same steady authority Daniel had heard the very first night she'd climbed into his car. And unlike the allegations you leveled against me, mine come with a paper trail. I'd like the board to consider 2 things today. First, whether Daniel Cole has ever received a single unearned benefit from his relationship with me, and the investigation your own HR department conducted this week found absolutely nothing. And second, whether the man who tried to end my career using stolen photographs and anonymous emails and his brother-in-law's home internet connection is the kind of leader this company wants sitting in this boardroom at all. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. The silver-haired board member finally spoke, looking not at Elena but at Marcus, something cold settling into his expression. Marcus, I think you should step outside while the board deliberates. Marcus stood, his face flushed, now all pretense of calm finally abandoned. You're going to let her walk away from this ACEO who's compromised her judgment for a relationship with a warehouse coordinator, and you're going to blame me for bringing it to light. I'm going to let the board make its decision based on facts. The board member said evenly, rather than a smear campaign built on stolen surveillance footage. Sit down, Marcus, or leave. Those are your only two options right now. Marcus looked around the room, searching for an ally. Finding none, every board member's expression had shifted subtly but unmistakably from cautious concern to something closer to disgust. He gathered his folder, his composure entirely gone now, and walked out of the conference room without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click that felt to Daniel louder than anything else that had happened all morning. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. Daniel spent every one of them sitting in a small waiting room down the hall. Elena beside him, both of them silent. Her hand gripped tight in his, the events of the morning still ringing in his ears. "You didn't tell me about the auditor," he said finally quietly. "I didn't want to get your hopes up in case it didn't work," Elena admitted. "I hired her the same day Marcus called that first meeting. I knew he wouldn't stop at threats. Men like him never do. I just didn't know if I'd be able to prove it in time." "You did?" Daniel said. "You proved it. We don't know that yet," Elena said, and Daniel could hear underneath the exhaustion real fear still lingering, the fear of a woman who had spent 20 years building something and understood better than anyone how quickly it could still be taken from her board approval or not. They sat together in silence after that, waiting the minutes stretching long and taut, until finally the conference room door opened again and Elena was called back inside. Daniel waited alone, the seconds ticking by with excruciating slowness, until the door opened once more and Elena stepped out, and the look on her face before she said a single word told him everything he needed to know. The board had voted unanimously to retain her as CEO. Marcus Reed's employment was terminated that same afternoon, cited officially for conduct unbecoming of a senior executive, a carefully worded phrase that would follow him into every future job interview for the rest of his career. Elena crossed the small waiting room and wrapped her arms around Daniel, holding on tightly. The armor finally fully dissolved, just a woman who had nearly lost everything and hadn't. "It's over," she whispered into his shoulder. "It's actually over." But even as he held her, even as relief flooded through him, hot and overwhelming, Daniel felt something else settling underneath it, a quieter, harder truth he hadn't fully let himself examine yet, one that had been building in him since the moment those photographs had first hit that conference room table. The board had cleared them. Marcus was gone. On paper, the crisis had ended exactly the way they'd hoped it would. But Daniel had spent the last 9 days watching Elena's entire professional world weigh in publicly and privately on whether their relationship was a liability the company could survive. He'd sat in a windowless room, answering questions about his own integrity to strangers who'd already half decided what they thought of him. He'd watched his daughter ask why he wasn't smiling right, watched his sister's name get dragged into a corporate smear campaign through nothing more than a public records search, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a thought had taken root in him that he couldn't quite shake loose, no matter how tightly Elena held him in that small waiting room. As long as he worked for her, as long as there was an org chart connecting his name to hers, a badge that swiped him into the same building where she sat in the corner office, there would always be another Marcus Reed. Maybe not this year. Maybe not with photographs and anonymous emails. But someday, someone else in that building would look at the two of them and see leverage instead of love. And Daniel understood with a clarity that settled cold and certain in his chest that he could not spend the rest of his life waiting for the next attack. He didn't say any of it to Elena that afternoon. She deserved at least for one evening to simply feel the relief of having survived. But driving home that night, Sophie asleep in the back seat after Diane had finally released her into his custody, with a long worried hug and a whispered, "Are you two okay?" Daniel understood that the board's vote hadn't actually ended anything. It had only bought them time to figure out what they were willing to sacrifice to make this relationship something that could actually last. The relief lasted about a week. Daniel would remember that later, how short a week actually was, how quickly the mind could move from "we survived" to "but at what cost," once the adrenaline of the board meeting faded and ordinary life reasserted itself in all its small telling details. It started with the way people looked at him in the break room. Not hostile, not anymore. Marcus's termination had settled that particular question definitively, and most of the office gossip had shifted in the way office gossip always did, from suspicion of Daniel to something closer to fascination. He was, whether he liked it or not, now a known quantity. The guy dating the CEO. People smiled at him in the hallway, who'd never once acknowledged his existence in 6 years. A woman from marketing asked him with poorly disguised curiosity what Elena Marsh was like in real life. Gerald started routing certain decisions through him that had nothing to do with his actual job description, as if proximity to Elena had somehow expanded Daniel's authority by osmosis. None of it was cruel. All of it made his skin crawl. "They're treating me differently," he told Elena one evening, sitting across from her at his kitchen table, Sophie already asleep down the hall. "Not badly, just differently. Like I'm not actually a person anymore. Like I'm an extension of you." "I know," Elena said quietly, and there was real guilt in it, the same guilt that had been sitting behind her eyes ever since the board meeting, unspoken but constant. "I've been thinking about that too." "Have you?" "Every day." She turned her coffee mug slowly between her hands, not drinking it, just needing something to hold. "Daniel, I won that board vote. Marcus is gone. On paper we're safe. But I keep thinking about what it actually took to get there, the auditor. The paper trail. The vote that could have gone the other way just as easily. We got lucky. If Marcus had been even slightly more careful, if that anonymous email hadn't been traceable, we might be having a very different conversation right now." "I know," Daniel said. "And even with Marcus gone, there will be another Marcus eventually. Maybe not this year. Maybe not with photographs. But someone someday is going to look at us and see an opportunity instead of two people who happen to love each other. As long as there's a reporting line, any reporting line, direct or indirect, connecting your position to mine, we will always be vulnerable to exactly what just happened." Daniel had known this conversation was coming. He'd felt it building since the moment he'd sat in that waiting room watching Elena's face when she came out of the board meeting relief, and something heavier underneath it. Something neither of them had said out loud yet. "So what are you saying?" he asked. Elena looked up at him, and for a woman who ran board meetings without blinking, who had spent 20 years learning never to let anyone see her hesitate, she looked in that moment more uncertain than he had ever seen her. "I'm saying I think you should leave the company," she said. "And I hate that I'm saying it because it feels like I'm asking you to give up something you built with your own 2 hands, something that has nothing to do with me. But Daniel, I can't keep watching you get treated like a liability every single day, and I can't keep waiting for the next person smart enough to weaponize what we have. I want a relationship that doesn't require a corporate lawyer and a forensic auditor to defend it." Daniel sat with that for a long moment, his coffee going cold in front of him, the weight of 6 years pressing down on his chest. 6 years of steady, unglamorous work of building something quiet and dependable in the wreckage of his divorce, of proving to himself piece by piece that he could still hold a life together on his own. "You know what that job represents to me," he said finally quietly. "It's not just a paycheck, Elena. It's the thing I built when everything else fell apart. It's proof that I could still show up every day and be reliable even when my whole world had come undone. Asking me to walk away from that—" "I know what I'm asking," Elena said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words. "I know exactly what I'm asking, and I hate every part of it. But I'd rather ask you to leave a job than watch you lose something bigger, because I was too selfish to say it out loud." Daniel didn't answer her that night. He needed time. Real time, not the frantic, adrenaline-fueled decision-making of the last 2 weeks, but actual careful thought, the kind he hadn't allowed himself in longer than he could remember. He drove to his sister's house the next afternoon, Sophie occupied with a movie in the living room, and sat with Diane at her kitchen table, the same table where this entire impossible chapter of his life had technically begun weeks earlier. "She wants me to leave the company," he told her. Diane raised an eyebrow, unsurprised in a way that irritated him slightly. "Of course she does. Daniel, you two just survived a corporate coup. Do you really think this was going to be the last time someone tried to use your job against you? That's what she said. She's right. Diane reached across the table and squeezed his hand, the same gesture she'd been making since they were kids, since their own parents' divorce had taught both of them, far too young, what it looked like when a family came apart quietly instead of loudly. Daniel, I watched you build that job into a fortress after Rachel left. I know what it means to you. I know it's not just a paycheck. But baby brother, a fortress isn't the same thing as a life. You've been telling yourself for 6 years that safety was the whole goal. Maybe it's time to ask what you actually want the goal to be now. What if I leave and it doesn't work out with Elena? Daniel asked, voicing the fear he hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even to Elena herself. What if I give up 6 years of stability for a relationship that falls apart in a year, and I'm left starting over completely at 38 with a kid depending on me? What if you stay, Diane said gently, and you spend the next 10 years resenting a woman you love because every time somebody looks at you sideways in that building, you remember. It was her world. You sacrificed your peace to be part of Daniel. You can't build a life with someone by keeping one foot permanently in an exit door. Eventually you have to actually walk all the way in or walk all the way out. There's no safe middle. Daniel sat with that for a long time after Diane went to check on Sophie, staring out at the same backyard swing set where all of this had started, turning the decision over and over in his mind, looking for the version of it that didn't require him to risk everything. He couldn't find one. There wasn't one. There never had been. Not since the night a CEO climbed into his passenger seat and told him he didn't get a vote. He gave his notice on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the board meeting, walking into Gerald's office with a resignation letter he'd rewritten 4 times the night before, trying to find words that felt honest instead of dramatic. "You don't have to do this," Gerald said, reading the letter with visible surprise, an emotion Daniel hadn't expected from a man who'd spent the last several weeks avoiding eye contact with him in hallways. "The investigation cleared you completely, Daniel. Nobody here thinks you did anything wrong." "I know," Daniel said. "This isn't about clearing my name, Gerald. It's about giving both of us, me and Elena, a chance to actually build something without every decision I make getting scrutinized for favoritism. And without every decision she makes about me getting questioned by a board that's already proven it'll use it as ammunition. I can't keep working somewhere that treats my relationship like a legal liability. It's not fair to her, and honestly, it's not fair to me either." Gerald sat back in his chair, studying him for a long moment. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "you were a good employee, one of the most reliable people in this department. I'm sorry it took almost losing everything for this company to finally notice that." Daniel walked out of that office feeling something strange and unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not relief exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The particular terrifying lightness of a man who had just voluntarily stepped off solid ground for the first time in 6 years, with absolutely no guarantee of what waited beneath him. He told Elena that night, and watched her face move through several emotions at once. Gratitude, guilt, fear. And underneath all of it, something that looked unmistakably like love. "You didn't have to do this today," she said. "You could have taken more time." "I've had 6 years of time, Elena," Daniel said. "I don't need more of it. I need to actually start living instead of just surviving." The weeks that followed were harder than either of them expected, in ways that had nothing to do with Marcus Reed or board meetings or corporate politics, and everything to do with the far more ordinary, far more human difficulty of 2 people learning how to build a life together without the crisis that had, in its own strange way, been holding them together with adrenaline and urgency. Without the daily rhythm of the job, Daniel found himself adrift in a way he hadn't anticipated. He'd built his identity so carefully around being reliable, around showing up, around the specific, unglamorous competence of a man who kept the trains running on time in a logistics department nobody thought twice about, and without that structure, he felt some mornings like he'd lost a piece of himself he hadn't realized was load-bearing. "I don't know who I am without a job to go to," he admitted to Elena one evening, 3 weeks into his unemployment, sitting on his back porch with a beer he hadn't finished, watching Sophie chase fireflies in the yard below them. "That sounds pathetic, probably," It doesn't sound pathetic, Elena said. It sounds honest. I felt exactly like that after my divorce from the company in a way. Not literally, I never left Halstead. But the year I almost sold it back, when the investors were pushing me toward an acquisition offer that would have made me rich and irrelevant on the same day, I remember lying awake wondering who I'd be if I wasn't the CEO. It's a real fear, Daniel. It doesn't make you weak for having it. How did you get past it? I didn't sell the company, Elena said, smiling slightly. I found a different way. I think you will too. You're not defined by a logistics department, Daniel, even if it feels that way right now. You're defined by the fact that you rebuilt an entire life from nothing after your divorce, and you did it without anyone's help, and you did it while raising a daughter who adores you. That's not something a job title gave you. That was always just you. Daniel let that settle, watching Sophie's small silhouette dart across the darkening yard, jar in hand, chasing light. I applied for a few things, he admitted. Nothing at your level, obviously. Regional logistics manager position at a shipping company across town. Independent, no connection to Halstead at all. How do you feel about it? Terrified, Daniel said honestly. But it's my terror, not something that got handed to me by a board meeting. That matters more than I expected it to. He got the job 3 weeks later, better pay than Halstead had offered him in 6 years. More responsibility, a company small enough that nobody there had ever heard of Elena Marsh or cared to. Daniel walked into his first day with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling into his chest. Something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. It felt like starting over, not out of fear this time, out of choice. The relationship, freed from the immediate threat of corporate warfare, revealed new challenges neither of them had fully anticipated. Smaller, quieter, more human difficulties that no board investigation could have prepared them for. There was the question of Elena's schedule, unforgiving in a way Daniel hadn't fully understood until he was dating someone who ran a $12 billion company. Nights that were supposed to be dinner together collapsed into last-minute board calls. A weekend trip they'd planned for months got canceled twice because of an unexpected crisis in the company's European division. Daniel found himself more than once sitting alone at his kitchen table with a dinner going cold. Sophie already asleep, waiting for a text that said, "Elena wasn't coming after all. I feel like I'm competing with a company for your attention." He told her one night after the second canceled weekend trip, trying and failing to keep the hurt entirely out of his voice. "You're not competing," Elena said, exhausted guilt written across her face, in a way that told Daniel she'd already been fighting this same battle internally long before he'd said anything out loud. "But I understand why it feels that way. I built this company with 18-hour days for 20 years, Daniel. I don't know how to run it any other way yet. I'm trying. I promise you I'm trying. I'm not asking you to stop being who you are," Daniel said carefully. "I fell in love with the woman who builds $12 billion companies. I'm not asking you to become someone smaller so I feel more comfortable. I'm just asking, is there room in that life for me and Sophie to actually be a priority, and not just something you fit in around the edges when the company allows it?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than Daniel had ever heard it. "I don't know how to do that yet. I've never had to make room for anyone before. I don't have practice at this, Daniel. I'm going to get it wrong sometimes." "I know," Daniel said. "I'm not asking for perfect. I raised a kid alone for 6 years. I know exactly how far perfect is from actually possible. I'm just asking you to keep trying. That's all any of this requires. Not perfection. Just trying over and over, even when it's hard." Elena reached for his hand across the table, and for the first time since the board meeting, Daniel saw something in her face that looked less like guilt and more like genuine resolve. "I'm going to hire a COO, she said suddenly. "What? I've been putting it off for years. Delegating that much control has always felt like admitting I can't do it all myself. But I can't keep doing 18-hour days and also be the kind of partner you and Sophie deserve. I need someone I trust, running day-to-day operations, so I can actually show up for the people who matter more than quarterly earnings calls." She looked at him with something fierce and determined settling into her expression the same look Daniel imagined she'd worn walking into rooms full of investors who doubted her at 26. I built this company because I didn't think anyone would ever choose me over what I could offer them. You choosing me anyway, even after I nearly cost you your job, that's worth restructuring an entire company for Daniel. I mean that.
Chekitame.
Sophie's 9th birthday fell on a Saturday in late spring, 6 months after the night Elena had first climbed into Daniel's passenger seat, and Elena spent 3 weeks planning it with an intensity Daniel found both hilarious and deeply moving. A dinosaur-themed party, complete with a paleontologist Elena had personally recruited from a local university to give a real hands-on fossil demonstration, because, as Elena put it, with total seriousness, she deserves the actual expert, not just me reciting facts I looked up. Watching Elena Marsh, CEO of a $12 billion company, kneeling in Daniel's backyard, helping a visiting paleontologist set up a sandbox full of buried plastic bones for a treasure hunt, wearing jeans with dirt on the knees. Laughing freely, in a way the business magazines had never once captured, Daniel felt something settle fully, and finally into place in his chest, a certainty he hadn't let himself feel completely until that exact moment. "Thank you," he said, finding a quiet moment beside her near the grill, watching Sophie shriek with delight over a plastic fossil she'd unearthed. "For what?" "For choosing this," Daniel said, gesturing at the backyard, the sandbox, the ordinary, unglamorous chaos of a 9-year-old's birthday party. "You could be anywhere in the world right now. You could be at a gala, closing a deal, doing any of the 1,000 things people who run companies like yours are supposed to be doing on a Saturday. Instead, you're here covered in sand teaching my kid about fossils." Elena leaned against him, watching Sophie run across the yard toward Diane, both of them laughing over something Daniel couldn't hear. "I spent 20 years thinking the company was the only thing that would ever make me feel like I mattered," she said quietly. "I built an entire identity out of being indispensable to a business. But Daniel, indispensable to a business isn't the same thing as loved. I didn't understand the difference until her." She nodded toward Sophie, still running, still laughing, entirely unaware of how much the woman watching her had rearranged an empire to be standing in this backyard. "This is the first birthday party I've ever attended in my life where nobody wanted anything from me except my attention. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How much I needed it without even knowing I needed it?" Daniel pulled her closer, the smell of charcoal smoke and cut grass thick in the warm spring air. Sophie's laughter carrying across the yard, and understood standing there that whatever had started in a parking garage with an opened car door and an impossible demand had become something neither of them had fully expected. Not just a relationship survived, but a life actually built piece by careful piece, out of two people who'd both spent years convinced that safety and happiness could never coexist. They'd been wrong. Both of them. It had just taken almost losing everything to prove it. Sophie came barreling toward them a moment later, both hands full of plastic fossils, breathless with excitement, and grabbed Elena's hand without hesitation, tugging her back toward the sandbox. "Come see what I found. The paleontologist lady says it's a real replica of a real thing that was really alive." Elena laughed that free, unguarded laugh Daniel had come to love more than almost any sound in the world, and let herself be pulled back into the chaos of the party, glancing back at him once over her shoulder with an expression that needed no words at all. Daniel stood by the grill a moment longer, watching them, watching the life he'd been too afraid to want finally taking shape in front of him, and thought not for the first time about how close he'd come to never opening that car door at all. He was glad, more than he could ever fully say, that some choices simply refused to wait for permission. A year moved faster than Daniel expected it to. That was the thing nobody warned him about when he'd been drowning in the chaos of board meetings and blackmail folders, and the terrifying uncertainty of walking away from 6 years of stability. That eventually, if you were lucky, the crisis passed, and what came after was just life, ordinary and unremarkable, and quietly extraordinary in the way that ordinary life could be when you'd finally stopped bracing for it to fall apart. His new job at the shipping company had turned into something he genuinely loved, in a way he hadn't expected. Regional Operations Manager, a title that still felt slightly unfamiliar in his mouth. A team of 14 people who reported to him and trusted his judgment, without a single one of them knowing or caring that his girlfriend ran a $12 billion tech company on the other side of town. Nobody there looked at him differently. Nobody there had ever heard the name Elena Marsh. He went to work every morning as simply Daniel Cole, competent and reliable, and entirely his own man, and came home every evening to a life that felt for the first time since his divorce completely and uncomplicatedly his. Elena's COO, a sharp, steady woman named Priya Anand, hired 6 months after the board meeting with a mandate to take over the operational grind. Elena had spent 20 years refusing to delegate, had changed everything about the shape of their relationship. Elena still worked hard, still carried the weight of a company that size on her shoulders. But she was home for dinner, 4 nights out of 5 now, instead of 1 out of 5. And when a crisis did pull her away, she called. Instead of simply not showing up, gave Daniel real information. Instead of vague apologies, treated her absence like something that required explanation, rather than something he should simply accept as the cost of loving her. I used to think delegation was weakness. She admitted to him one night, 8 months into the new arrangement curled against his side on the porch swing, that had somehow become, without either of them planning it, the place where they had their most important conversations. I thought if I wasn't doing everything myself, I wasn't really earning any of it. Priya took that apart in about a week. She told me the healthiest companies aren't built by CEOs who never sleep. They're built by CEOs smart enough to know which battles actually need them personally in the room. Smart woman, Daniel said. She usually is. It's mildly infuriating. Elena laughed soft and warm, the sound of it still capable of catching Daniel off guard, sometimes still capable of making him feel a full year in exactly the way he'd felt the first night she'd made him laugh on this very swing. Sophie turned 10 in the spring, and by then, Elena wasn't just a fixture at birthday parties. She was simply unremarkably part of the family's architecture. The way a load-bearing wall becomes so essential to a house that you forget it was ever added after the original structure went up. She picked Sophie up from school on Wednesdays when Daniel's work ran late. She'd learned through months of patient trial and error how to braid hair properly better than Daniel had ever managed, a fact Sophie brought up with irritating regularity. She kept a drawer in her penthouse, the penthouse Daniel still occasionally teased her about. Still found faintly absurd against the backdrop of grilled steaks and dinosaur books, stocked with Sophie's favorite snacks, and a spare toothbrush for the nights Sophie stayed over, and the 3 of them ordered pizza and watched movies on a couch worth more than Daniel's entire car. It was Sophie, in fact, who brought up the question neither adult had quite worked up the nerve to ask out loud yet. "Are you and Elena going to get married?" She asked one evening entirely without warning, halfway through a plate of spaghetti, in the blunt and devastating way only a 10-year-old could deliver a question that had been quietly reshaping her father's chest for months. Daniel nearly choked on his water. Elena, across the table, went very still, a small, careful smile fighting its way onto her face. "Why do you ask that, Bug?" Daniel managed. "Because you look at each other the way people look at each other in movies right before the wedding part," Sophie said, entirely matter-of-fact, twirling spaghetti onto her fork like she hadn't just detonated a grenade in the middle of dinner. "And also because Aunt Diane said when they get married, not if. And grown-ups always slip up like that when it's actually true." Elena laughed so hard she had to set down her fork, and Daniel felt his face heat with something between embarrassment and a helpless kind of joy, watching the 2 most important people in his life sit at his kitchen table, discussing his love life like it was a foregone conclusion he simply hadn't caught up to yet. "Your aunt talks too much," Daniel said. "Is that a no?" Sophie pressed, undeterred. Daniel looked across the table at Elena, at the woman who had climbed into his car 18 months ago, with a plan and a timeline, and absolutely no idea. It would cost her nearly everything, who had rebuilt her entire professional life to make room for a family she'd never planned on wanting, who had learned to braid hair and buy the right snacks and show up over and over exactly when she said she would. and felt the answer settle into him with a certainty he hadn't expected to feel quite this plainly, quite this soon at his own kitchen table, ambushed by his own 10-year-old. "It's not a no," he said quietly, eyes still on Elena. Elena's breath caught audibly. Sophie, entirely unbothered by the enormity of the moment she'd just caused, went back to her spaghetti with the satisfied air of a child who had simply confirmed something she'd known all along. "Good," she said. "Because I already told my whole class you're basically already married. I don't want to have to correct that." He proposed in June on a Friday because it felt right to close the loop of it that way, the same day of the week that had started everything, the day that had once belonged entirely to steak and old movies, and a fortress of careful, guarded routine. He didn't do anything elaborate. He'd thought about it, considered briefly some grand public gesture, a restaurant, a ring hidden in dessert, the kind of thing he imagined a woman like Elena might be used to from a lifetime of being courted by men with something to prove. He decided against all of it almost immediately. That wasn't them. That had never been them. Instead, he grilled steaks in his backyard, the same ribeyes he'd been buying every Friday for years. Sophie set the table with the mismatched plates Elena had once sat cross-legged in a suit to eat off of. And after dinner, once Sophie had been sent inside under the transparent pretense of getting the good napkins. Daniel knelt down on the same worn grass where a dinosaur-themed birthday party had once convinced him he was watching the shape of his real life finally take form. "I had a whole speech planned," he admitted, ring box open hands steadier than he expected them to be. "I wrote it out 4 times. I couldn't get it right, so I'm just going to say the true thing instead." "That's usually the better version anyway," Elena said, already crying, already laughing, both at once. "You climbed into my car 18 months ago and told me I didn't get a vote," Daniel said. "You were right, I didn't. Not about that night, and honestly, looking back, I don't think I've had a vote in loving you since the second you crouched down in that suit to talk to my daughter about dinosaurs. I tried to build a life where nothing could touch me, Elena. You touched all of it anyway. And I have never, not for one single day since, regretted letting you in." He didn't get through the rest of it. Elena pulled him up before he could finish kissing him hard enough that the ring box nearly went flying, and somewhere behind them at the kitchen window, Sophie let out a shriek of triumph loud enough that half the neighborhood probably heard it already, texting Diane the news before either adult had even fully separated. "That's a yes, by the way," Elena said, laughing against his mouth, "in case that wasn't clear." "I got that impression." "Good, because Sophie's right. I've basically been your wife for months. It's about time we made it official." The wedding, when it finally happened the following spring, was nothing like the corporate gala Marcus Reed had once implied. Elena's relationships would inevitably become no board members, no shareholders, no press. Elena had insisted on that firmly, the same firmness Daniel had first seen in a parking garage nearly 2 years earlier. "I spent 20 years having every major decision in my life scrutinized by people who had a financial stake in the outcome," she told him during one of the few actual planning conversations they'd had, most of which had involved considerably less debate than either of them expected. "I am not having my wedding turned into a headline. This is for us, for Sophie, for the people who actually love us, instead of what we can do for them." They married in Diane's backyard, the same modest blue rancher, the same swing set, the same porch where all of it had technically begun. The very first night Daniel drove Elena there in his rattling Explorer and watched her fall instantly and completely for an 8-year-old's dinosaur facts. 50 guests folding chairs a barbecue instead of catering, because Elena had insisted over Diane's mild protests that nothing else would feel true to how they'd actually fallen in love. Sophie 11, now gap-toothed grin, long since filled in, served as flower girl and self-appointed wedding coordinator, bossing the small assembly of guests into their seats with an authority that made the actual guests laugh and made Daniel's chest ache with a particular overwhelming pride. Elena walked toward him down a short grass aisle in a simple dress. No security detail, no assistants hovering at the edges, Nothing of the armor she'd worn for 20 years standing between them anymore. Just a woman finally completely choosing an ordinary life over an empire. Not because the empire had failed her, but because she'd finally learned that she didn't have to choose only one. "You look terrified," she whispered when she reached him, taking his hands. "I am," Daniel admitted. "Good terrified, though. The kind you taught me is worth having." "Scared and honest?" Elena said, echoing words from a porch swing nearly 2 years old. Now words that had somehow become the foundation everything else had been built on top of. "I told you. I'll take that over safe and empty every single time." They exchanged vows that owed nothing to tradition and everything to the specific hard-won truth of what they'd survived together. A blackmail attempt, a board vote, a career sacrificed and rebuilt a fortress, dismantled brick by careful brick, until what remained wasn't rubble, but foundation. Daniel promised, among other things, to never again let fear convince him that safety and happiness were opposites. Elena promised to keep learning how to put people before boardrooms, a lesson she admitted through tears she suspected she'd be relearning for the rest of her life, and was grateful, endlessly grateful, to have the chance to keep practicing. Diane cried through the entire ceremony. Sophie cried harder, though she'd deny it fiercely for years afterward, insisting she'd simply had something in her eye. They built a life afterward that looked from the outside almost defiantly ordinary, which was, Daniel understood eventually, exactly the point. Elena kept running. Halstead Dynamics kept building and innovating and closing deals that made headlines in business magazines. Daniel still found faintly surreal to see his wife's face on. But she came home for dinner. She coached Sophie's science fair project, 2 years running the second one, earning an actual ribbon framed now in Daniel's front hallway beside a photo of the 3 of them at Sophie's 12th birthday party. She still occasionally worked late, still occasionally had to travel for board matters and investor meetings. But the balance had shifted permanently, irreversibly, into something neither of them had believed possible the night she'd first climbed uninvited into his passenger seat and upended a life he'd spent 6 careful years protecting. Daniel, for his part, had stopped flinching every time something good happened, stopped waiting in the back of his mind for the other shoe to drop the way it always had after his divorce. It had taken nearly a year of marriage for that particular fear to fully release its grip on him, a year of Elena showing up again and again exactly when she said she would, of Sophie thriving in a household that finally had 2 steady adults in it, instead of one exhausted single father doing his absolute best of ordinary Fridays that no longer needed to be defended, like the last fortress standing against a world that had once taken everything from him. Marcus Reed. They heard eventually through the particular grapevine that always seemed to connect former colleagues, no matter how far apart their paths diverged, had struggled to find comparable work. After Halstead, his termination followed him the specific language of conduct unbecoming a senior executive, proving harder to explain away in interviews than he'd probably anticipated when he'd first opened that folder of stolen photographs. Daniel felt when he heard the news less satisfaction than he expected. Mostly just a quiet, settled relief that the man's attempt to weaponize their happiness had ultimately cost him far more than it had ever cost them. "Do you ever think about him?" Daniel asked Elena once, nearly 3 years after the board meeting, the 2 of them sitting on the same porch swing that had witnessed nearly every important conversation of their relationship. Sophie, now 13, and upstairs ostensibly doing homework, actually judging by the muffled laughter video calling a friend. "Sometimes," Elena admitted. "Mostly I think about how close he came to actually winning. How easily this could have gone differently if that auditor hadn't found the trail in time, if even one board member had voted the other way. It still scares me thinking about it." "But it didn't go differently," Daniel said. "No." Elena agreed, leaning into him, the porch swing creaking its familiar rhythm beneath them. "It didn't. And honestly, I think about that almost as much as I think about him. How much of this, all of it, the wedding, Sophie, this exact porch swing came down to one board vote that could have gone either way. It makes me grateful in a way I don't think I've ever fully been able to explain to anyone but you." "You don't have to explain it to me," Daniel said. "I think about it too. Every single day, honestly." How close I came to never opening that car door. How close both of us came to staying exactly where we were safe and successful and completely alone. I'm glad you opened it, Elena said quietly. I didn't have much of a vote, Daniel reminded her, smiling. As I recall, someone was very clear about that. Elena laughed, that same free, unguarded sound that had first caught him off guard on a porch swing nearly 3 years earlier, still capable even now of settling something warm and permanent into his chest. Looking back on it later, and Daniel did look back on it often in quiet moments that had become far more common in his life than the frantic defensive vigilance he'd once mistaken for peace. He understood that the story had never really been about a CEO and a coordinator about the improbable collision of two people from entirely different worlds. It had been about two forms of the exact same fear wearing very different clothes. Elena had spent 20 years convinced that vulnerability was the one luxury a woman in her position could never afford. That letting anyone close enough to matter was the same thing as handing them a weapon. Daniel had spent 6 years convinced that safety required distance, that the only way to protect what remained of his heart after his divorce was to keep it locked far enough away that nothing could ever reach it again. They had both been right in a narrow defensive sense. Both of their fortresses had in fact kept them safe from further harm. But safety, Daniel had come to understand, was never actually the same thing as living. It was just a very convincing, very lonely substitute for it. What had saved them both in the end wasn't luck, though. Luck had certainly played its part. An auditor who found the trail in time, a board willing to look past a smear campaign and see the truth underneath it. What had actually saved them was the harder, less comfortable choice each of them made over and over to keep choosing each other, even when it would have been so much easier, so much safer to retreat back into the fortresses they'd both spent years perfecting. Daniel walking away from 6 years of hard-won stability because staying would have meant loving Elena only halfway. Elena rebuilding an entire company's leadership structure because winning that board vote meant nothing if it cost her the one relationship that had finally taught her what it felt like to be wanted for nothing more than herself. Sophie, now a teenager with opinions about everything and a fierce, protective love for both her parents that occasionally surprised even Daniel with its intensity, would sometimes ask about that first night. The story had become something of a family legend, by then told and retold at holidays, embellished slightly with each retelling, Elena's dramatic entrance into the passenger seat growing more theatrical with every Thanksgiving dinner. "Weren't you scared?" Sophie asked once, curled on the couch between them on a quiet Sunday evening, the question arriving with the particular seriousness teenagers sometimes surprised you with, underneath all their usual deflection and sarcasm. "When she just got in your car like that, weren't you scared of what would happen?" Daniel considered the question honestly, the way he tried to consider everything Sophie asked him, now that she was old enough to actually want real answers instead of comfortable ones. "Terrified," he admitted. "I'd spent 6 years making sure nothing could ever surprise me like that again. And then your soon-to-be stepmother climbed into my car and completely dismantled every plan I had for staying safe in about 4 minutes. So why'd you drive?" Sophie pressed. "You could have just told her to get out." Daniel glanced at Elena, who was watching him with the same quiet, patient attention she'd given him the very first night, waiting to hear how he'd answer, even after 3 years of marriage, even after having heard some version of this story 100 times before. "Because somewhere underneath being terrified," Daniel said slowly, "I think I already knew that the safest thing I'd ever built for myself wasn't actually keeping me safe. It was just keeping me small. And some part of me, some part I hadn't listened to in a long time, wanted to find out what might happen if I finally let someone drive that fear out of me instead of feeding it." Sophie considered this with the particular gravity of a 13-year-old encountering for the first time the idea that adults were once just as frightened and uncertain as she sometimes felt. "That's actually kind of romantic," she admitted grudgingly in the tone of a teenager conceding a point she'd rather not concede. "It's actually kind of true," Elena said, reaching for Daniel's hand, The way she had on 1,000 ordinary evenings, since the gesture no longer new, no longer fragile with uncertainty, just simply permanently theirs. Outside, the evening settled gold and quiet over the same modest house with the gutter. Daniel had finally eventually gotten around to fixing the same backyard where Sophie had once chased fireflies, while two frightened, hopeful adults figured out how to trust each other on a porch swing that had somehow become the true center of their entire life together. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It had never needed to be. It was simply a home, built by two people who had once believed that love and safety could never coexist, and who had learned slowly, and at considerable cost, that the truest safety was never found in walls at all. It was found in choosing deliberately, and without a vote, to keep opening the door for each other every single day for the rest of their lives. That in the end was the whole of it. Not a CEO and a coordinator. Not a scandal survived, or a board vote won. Just two people who had finally understood that the bravest thing either of them would ever do wasn't building a fortress strong enough to keep the world out. It was tearing one down brick by brick to let somebody in, and discovering on the other side of that fear, not the ruin they'd spent years dreading, but the first real home either of them had ever known.